Ladies and gentlemen, YEM is Erasmus and Erasmus is YEM. Erasmus provides for so many opportunities to study, to volunteer, to work, to intern, to educate, and even just to meet young people. Everything that we as the Young European Movement UK stand for is incorporated into this program. The Turing replacement provides for one aspect of this, which is the study part. We as YEM stand behind the Erasmus program, and I'm really delighted to see so many attendees tonight that will join forces in bringing the UK back into Erasmus. Because after all, we as the Young European Movement stand for young people's opportunities. We stand for the fact that you're able to go abroad to a youth training course, to a youth exchange, to a volunteering course, and also to study abroad. And you broaden your horizon, you broaden your mindset, and you establish this interconnectedness of European cultures, which we as the Young European Movement deem so important, and which some political actors unfortunately would like to cut, because they would like to establish a society that is more focused on the nation, more focused on a nationalistic ideology, and they would like to cut the ties. We as the Young European Movement, we say we stand together, we stay European, and we stand with Erasmus. Thank you for coming tonight.
Hello everyone and welcome. It's great to see so many of you here today to join the conversation about what the opportunities are for students following the UK's withdrawal from the Erasmus Plus programme. My name is Sophie Heyer and I will be your host today. For the next 2 hours, I will be guiding you through talks and a Q&A sessions, of which all are looking to answer the question of what the withdrawal from the Erasmus Plus programme means for the prospects of young people and students in the UK and EU. Worldwide, students are engaged with student mobility programmes to a greater extent than ever before. Within the European continent, the Erasmus programme, later Erasmus Plus, has been a lead ever since its origins in 1987. Despite being one of its most active members, the United Kingdom has withdrawn from the student mobility programme, which is what we will discuss today. However, before introducing you to our speakers, I will share with you success stories of students who have participated in Erasmus+. Starting with my own experience with the programme, Erasmus Plus has enriched my life in so many ways. Not only has it enabled me to participate in a student exchange in Spain, but I wouldn't be here today if I wasn't able to join YEM UK as an Erasmus trainee this year. From these experiences, I have been able to explore different cultures and languages, work with people and students from all over Europe, and prepare myself for working life. Along with myself, we have a range of students who will share stories of how they were able to develop through their experiences with the programme.
Hi, my name is Claire and I'm a recent Law with French graduate from the University of Glasgow. I did my Erasmus at Sciences Po Lyon in France. Although we faced a lot of challenges during our Erasmus year, one being the pandemic, I would still say that it was one of the most formative experiences for me, both personally and academically. Meeting students from all different nationalities and integrating into one community was one of my favourite things about my Erasmus, as well as having the opportunity to improve my French by undertaking study in French, something which was very challenging, but I also found very rewarding. I know that my university, the University of Glasgow, was very disappointed with the decision that the United Kingdom would be leaving the Erasmus programme. And although I don't think that the gap that Erasmus leaves can ever truly be fully filled, I do think that the UK government should have the target of coming up with solutions that gives the maximum number of students the opportunity for international mobility, as it is something that I would recommend to anyone.
The Erasmus Plus program is the biggest success story of the European Union, in particular with regards to young people. I haven't only been able to go abroad on my Erasmus study, coming from the University of Aberdeen, going down south to France to study at Sciences Po Lyon, together with Claire from Glasgow University. I have been able to take advantage of the Erasmus program in not all, I should say, but many different angles of these opportunities that it provides. This, for example, doesn't just concern education as such, at university level neither. It includes elementary schools, it includes staff mobility, it includes tons of training opportunities. The reason why I became active in politics is because of youth exchanges that were organized around specific issues. I was trained on the question of human rights, on the question of climate change, on the question of migration and refugees. I became a facilitator myself thanks to this program, and this led me to certain professional opportunities that I wouldn't have had access to otherwise. But I don't just want to focus on the professional side of things, on the employability, which also brings a lot of advantage to the economy, by the way, because people speak languages, people know how to deal with different cultures, people know how to adapt to new environments. These are things that employers are looking for. Erasmus people, Erasmus graduates, Erasmus alumni are something really, really valuable also for the labor market. It is in the interest of the economy, but let's not only focus on that. Let's also bear in mind that Erasmus educates you personally. It opens your horizon. It makes you more tolerant. It makes you more adaptable. It makes you more culturally adaptable. All these things are so important to create the society of the future, to create young people that grow up in a world where we don't fight wars against each other, but where we live together in harmony, and where we can also move for a couple of years and live in another country. All of these opportunities, amongst others, meeting my girlfriend in an Erasmus training course, connect me so strongly to this program that I think we should really get it back. And it is the greatest thing that could have happened to European youth work across the continent. And we should make more and more partner countries part of Erasmus, and more program countries fully part of Erasmus. And that's what I would like to do.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. Firstly, thank you Sophie for giving me the opportunity to talk to everybody here about my Erasmus experience. It's really important that we have events like this to provide clarity going forward as the UK moves through its Brexit transition. So my Erasmus experience began in 2017. At the time, I was a third year at the University of Warwick in the UK, and I was provided the opportunity to go to the University of Copenhagen in Denmark to continue my study. Now, I was a bit overwhelmed at the time. I thought it was a fantastic opportunity to move to a new place, get out of the UK and start to experience a bit more of Europe that I hadn't seen before. Now, I owe a lot to my Erasmus experience, not only academically and socially. It gave me a brand new worldview that I wasn't particularly anticipating to get halfway through my university experience. From an academic standpoint, my year in Copenhagen gave me my first introduction to Kierkegaard and some Nordic mythology, which was a nice change. And on the social side, I know it's a cliche, but it's true. The experiences you have really are made by the people that you meet. And Erasmus really does bring together a great mix of people from all over the world and Europe, of course. I have friends that I met in Copenhagen that I still deal with on a daily basis. In fact, I'm meeting a few of them for a drink later this evening. And this is something that we really want to secure for students going forward. It also gave me the chance to explore Europe a bit more without having so many pressures. During a university time, I was able to travel around to Hungary and Czech Republic. I even managed to make a quick stop off at Oktoberfest, which was great. So this is brilliant. Thank you so much, Sophie. I owe so much to my Copenhagen experience, and I think it's wonderful that we're trying to secure these experiences for future students as we go forward. Thank you all and enjoy.
Thank you for these students sharing their stories with us today. Now, I'm excited to present our speakers for today's program. First up, we have Joanna Freitas, an expert on the Erasmus Plus program. Second, we have a video message from Stephen Farry, member of the Northern Ireland Parliament and Deputy Leader of the Alliance Party. Then we'll hear from Michael Russell, President of the SNP and former Cabinet Secretary for Education, on the situation in Scotland. And our fourth speaker is the Minister for Education and for the Welsh language, Jeremy Miles, who will be speaking about the TAKE programme. And finally, we will close with Iona Murdoch, President of the Erasmus Student Network in the UK. The event will be structured as follows. Each speaker will speak for around 10 to 15 minutes, and each of these talks will be followed by a short Q&A session in which you can ask your specific questions, except, of course, for Stephen Farry, due to his talk being via video. So if you have any questions for the speakers, please put them in the chat and we will get to as many as we can. And now, without further ado, I will pass over to our first speaker, Joanna Freitas.
Thank you very much. It's great to start with all of your stories, because myself, I would say I'm an expert in Erasmus because it's been 5 years that I'm actively involved, volunteering and professionally on Erasmus. But I'm also an Erasmus product myself. So I'm very happy to be here with you and to share a bit of my enthusiasm for Erasmus and some lessons learned with you. If the slides are ready, perfect. So when I got invited to this webinar, and thank you so much for inviting me, and a warm hello to everyone watching. It was a true challenge to decide on what to focus, because there's so much to Erasmus. So what I bring here is a short reflection on the importance of international mobility, and specifically some challenges and opportunities in Erasmus that can maybe be touching points with touring, or new programs that can be created on the UK side. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of an overview, because it's very hard to just say a little bit of each. So what I chose is the issue that I'm the most focused on and specialize on, which is inclusion. Because when I read the title of this webinar and it talked about strengthening student representation, I do believe that strengthening student representation is intricately connected to inclusion, because we cannot make things accessible to people we are not willing to listen. So I bring here a little bit of what are those issues and some possible opportunities with them. So before starting to speak specifically about Erasmus, I was told not all of you could be 100% familiar with it. So I bring you some quick definitions of what is Erasmus and what is mobility, because the word itself sometimes can be confusing because it's connected also to physical mobility and so on. So the difference between a mobility in an Erasmus project or in an international learning project is a learning mobility. So this learning word makes it different from a trip, from other traveling that you might make, because these experiences are dedicated to helping participants achieve specific learning outcomes, which can be formal or informal. But most of all, they are meant to challenge them to get out of their comfort zone, either that be your professional or academic comfort zone, but also your personal comfort zone. So the picture on the side to me would somehow explain what this experience can be. And I also brought a picture to answer the question, what is Erasmus Plus? Because as the videos shown us before, Erasmus is very complex. It includes a very big diversity of actors, of actions, and they all get tangled up under this big umbrella of Erasmus Plus. And we are talking from opportunities for kindergarten teachers to senior universities, policymaking, remote collaboration, and everything in between. So I do believe that Erasmus is a colorful mash of opportunities. So just for those who are not very familiar, here's a bit of data about Erasmus. So as one of the videos said before, it is considered one of the biggest successes of the European Union. It's a program that has been around for long. not as long as Erasmus Plus, the umbrella, but the European Commission started developing learning programs back in the 70s, 80s. So it's now a staple of the European Union. There are 33 countries that can apply directly for funding, that can be granted funding under Erasmus, and 145 partner countries. Sadly, we don't count the UK in the program countries anymore. Let's hope we can change that together. So for the current program, the budget was almost tripled from the previous programs, and this is funding of the European Union that is allocated through the 7-year financing tool. And this funding is dedicated to the learning mobilities I was just talking about, and also cross-cooperation projects, which can be in the field of education, ranging from early education to all sectors of lifelong learning, as well as informal and non-formal education, training, and here we have internships. We also have a very strong component of vocational education, but also again for professionals, the youth sector, and also for sport initiatives. So just to go a bit deeper what these initiatives can be, the Erasmus is structured in five major groups. This is something that I took from my thesis, which was dedicated to the issues of Erasmus and inclusion. So this is why this topic is especially close to me. And as you can see, there's a key action focus on individuals, which is what we often know. So when someone goes to study abroad or do an internship abroad, etc. But there's also a lot more inside of Erasmus, like the key action to projects that allow for schools to cooperate and to get their students initiated into Erasmus and to promote opportunities even for those who don't go to higher education. We have policy making in K3 that often these projects can be used to reach other actors that do not really have a place in the decision-making processes, and so on. And so by 2021, Erasmus celebrated its incredible success. A wide number of participants reached, but also this was the time when Erasmus openly acknowledged one of its biggest shortcomings, which is that these participants are still a rather restricted group. They are still rather privileged people, since most of the students are actually in the higher education sector even. So these numbers are not very updated because unfortunately we do not get reports on Erasmus as frequently as we would like, and sometimes the indicators change. But you can see that the number is really, really small of students that are considered having fewer opportunities, and this is a bureaucratic term created by the Commission to talk about people who have challenges related to disabilities, health, culture, economy, social obstacles as well, geographical, and now they also include challenges related to the education systems. But not only the number of fewer opportunities participants is small, but also mobility is still a very exclusive experience. So if we look at numbers, the people who get to go on mobility are still a very small percentage. And so the Commission is owning this, and the new program has different mechanisms and structures to fight this, which is fundamental because, as this quote tells you, when Erasmus fails to Erasmus and other opportunities for youth, this goes for all of them. If we fail to make them accessible to everyone and to engage all actors in them, then we're only reproducing what's already happening. So if the student who goes to well, not such a good school because they couldn't afford a better school, if they are still left out of these mobilities, they keep getting their opportunities restricted and facing the same cycle of inequalities. And so, as I was saying, the Commission took measures. The new Erasmus Plus program does foresee, and it has its own inclusion and diversity strategy. It foresees that each country will create their own. There's added funding for involving participants from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there's a clear priority on this. But often in Erasmus or other programs, we forget that it goes way beyond the visible barriers. So just the term of fewer opportunities is very challenging on its own. So how do we choose who has more or less opportunities? How do we compare this disadvantage? Do we ask these questions? What is ethical? What is not? And how do we make sure that we are using this properly and not just labeling people and somehow even making the whole situation worse? And on another hand, we have the issue of equality versus equity, because while the program seems to promote an idea of equality, to say everyone can come, they just need to sign up, the truth is that we all have different needs. And if the access is given in the same way to everyone, then those who are too far, like you can see in the picture, they will stay far away. And this comes with the issue that not all of the barriers to participation in youth programs are visible, of course, because there's so many things that for us, for professionals, for current participants who already have access, we can't see, but there's a bubble, there's these usual suspects, and those who are on the other side, we cannot really see why they can't get in. And it can be something as simple and which is simple and complex, like self-esteem. If I don't believe in myself, why would I put myself in a learning experience that's meant to challenge me? This is connected to this, I really like this effect, the Matthew and the pistachio effect. So the Matthew effect talks about how those who already have the information, those who are already visible, are the ones that keep getting it, which is something that happens in youth opportunities a lot. It's very easy to get more and more as you go, but it's not so easy to get started in the first place. And the pistachio effect was created by a UK youth worker to explain that without resources, without the proper structure to create equity, it's very hard to get to the harder to crack. So those young people that are harder to work with because they have different contexts, like the pistachios that are closed, they keep being left at the bottom of the bowl and forgotten, because it's just easier to go for those who are already engaged. And again, connecting to the topic of this session, so talking about strengthening student voices, there's also this very basic issue that these programs are created in the Commission, they come to the institutions, and they are given to students. And the young people who are actually benefiting from these opportunities don't really get a say in how those opportunities are shaped. So it's a set of challenges that I present to you, but also let's talk about opportunities and possibilities. So I truly believe, having worked in the school sector, in the youth sector, and now in the university sector, I truly believe that inclusion requires a comprehensive process of internationalization, which luckily within Erasmus it's possible, since we have all stages of education covered and also local actions. So I divided this in three main pillars. So talking about internationalization at home, because often, when we are children, we are told to not trust strangers, to not trust what we don't know. So why would people trust mobility experiences and want to take them up further if they've never been in contact with internationals, or if they never did an international project before? Maybe they have lack of language skills, maybe they are not comfortable going abroad for a month. So short-term mobilities, hybrid mobilities, tweening projects, or other remote cooperation projects are really strong. And I didn't want to bring too much information in, but there's data that really shows how powerful these experiences can be in order to create access to Erasmus, but even not. Sometimes having these experiences on its own can be very life-changing for a young person and just open possibilities for them. Another aspect that is often overlooked by the formal education sector and politicians is the importance of non-formal education. And by non-formal education here, I don't mean just youth workers, but I mean including people in decision processes, making them participatory, giving room for student voices, like I was just saying before. So making sure that what is created is co-created and that young people can take ownership of what they are doing, rather to just send them abroad to experiences that might frighten them or might not be adequate for them for a number of reasons. And this brings us, of course, to equality, diversity, and inclusion, because each target group has its own needs. It's almost, I would say, even each person has specific needs. And while institutions cannot cater for each person, they can and should listen to the people who are living those barriers and those obstacles every day, instead of deciding what they could need or what they would want. So I definitely think that this can never be detached from internationalization, because in the end, international projects are about promoting diversity and making room for everyone. And so to conclude, I would like to just leave you with a reflection of why does all of this matter? Erasmus Plus, inclusion, and creating integrated programs that can cover opportunities for all ranges of people. And I could give you these numbers alone. I think they are powerful enough on their own. So these are numbers from the impact studies of Erasmus from 2014 and 2019 that were the Commission ordered these studies. And the numbers are impressive. You can see that people improve language skills, social skills, but also there's proof that higher education students become a lot more employable. VET students, vocational education students who are in some countries disregarded from not having higher education degree, get a lot more, it's not here, but it's something that I can tell you, that they are regarded differently by their employees once they have a mobility experience. We have amazing results on people understanding what they would want from life, especially young people who still need to figure it out. Erasmus gives them an opportunity to do so. Staff as well, teachers and youth workers and so on, get inspired by what they see abroad, and they improve their own skills. And of course, we cannot overlook the aspect of valuing other cultures and being open to them, and etc. But I would say that you know most of this. So my final message, or my final sharing with you, is a bit more personal. Next slide, please. And so I leave you with the words of a former student of mine, Maria. Maria was my student in a vocational education high school, where, you know, the students, they come there after having been labeled many times as not good enough, as the dumb ones, as the ones who'll just, you know, skip university and be forced into the labor market because they are not good enough to go forward. And Maria, despite her own fears and insecurities, she decided to apply for a mobility experience. She did a short-term mobility, and like her, I can tell you stories of dozens of students who came back with a renewed confidence in themselves, more than any numbers or employability rates. They come with a renewed belief on themselves. They come believing that more is possible if they want to, because it's not because they go on Erasmus that they need to go to the university. They should do what feels right for them. And what I kept seeing student after student is that having a mobility experience empowered them to feel like they get to choose. That their horizons are broadened. And as cliche as it is, the same happened for their families, for their colleagues. So even just the colleagues that share the experience in the school, they would say, oh, wow, look, my colleague went abroad and now he speaks English, so maybe I can do it too. Maybe I can try this, maybe I can try that. Parents started going abroad, etc. So it does have an impact, even to mix a mobility experience. And thus we cannot overlook the need to make this an integral process that capacitates everyone and makes everyone feel safe to take part in them. Thank you so much for listening, and don't hesitate to leave your questions or to contact me.
The insightful presentation. So thank you so much. Looking at the comments, I've had a lot of questions or statements about the e-twinning program. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit on this program for us?
Well, I was lucky enough to be an e-twinner while I was a trainer at this school that I was just talking about. And e-twinning is an amazing platform for teachers from Europe and even outside of Europe, they can join in. Like Anna is saying, is a completely safe platform. So students have to prove, teachers need to prove that they are teachers to join, and there they can find partners to develop projects in. There's forums where you can just post an idea that you have for a project you'd like to develop with your class and find partners. So, for example, one of the projects I did with my students, because they were studying tourism and they were connected to restaurant businesses. So I said, okay, let's do a project about food. What do you think? And so they created a cookbook with colleagues from Italy and France, and they had meetings online in between. And then actually some of those students have decided to go on Erasmus after having this experience, even though at the beginning they would say, no, I hate English. I don't want to speak to foreign people. I have enough friends in Portugal. And then in the end, they got fascinated by the beautiful Italians and from the French colleagues that were so different, that had different races and cultures, which is something that it's not often very common in Portuguese classrooms, not in all cities. And so I think e-twinning, it's a real, I'm gutted that UK has left e-twinning, because it's indeed a beautiful platform to, especially in the inclusion part, it's fundamental to make sure that people get an internationalization experience, that it's not just mobility, because not everyone gets to go on mobility.
Thank you. As the comments say, you have provided an amazing overview of the Erasmus Plus program. I have a question from Scott, who is asking whether the Schumann traineeships are part of Erasmus Plus, or is this a separate program?
The Schumann traineeships are an initiative of the institutions, so they do not belong to Erasmus Plus. They are financed by the institutions.
Thank you. I also received a lot of questions about the Turing scheme. And the first one is from Jay Tree, and he or she is asking, what do you think of the Turing program?
Well, I mean, I think it's very hard to overlook the fact that Turing lives out the EU, especially because we were just talking about I was just talking about inclusion, and if maybe people are afraid, and if they're just being forced to go even outside their own neighbor countries, I mean, we cannot really go around it. It's much harder to go to Brazil than to Portugal, and there's no way to go around it. One thing that I think that the Turing did well, and that I can highlight, is the fact that short-term mobilities are allowed in higher education in a way that Erasmus doesn't allow them. So there's these impact studies that are done by UK Universities International that show the added value of short-term mobilities, again, also connected to inclusion. And Turing allows for that, and Erasmus does not. So that's the one plus, I would say, of Turing. But yes, I see the comments. I think you're all very aware of its limitations, and indeed it has a long road to go before it can be an alternative to Erasmus Plus, I would say.
Thank you. I have another question from Jackie, if I pronounce it correctly, who is asking, are the mentorship schemes to encourage those from disadvantaged backgrounds to apply for Erasmus in the EU?
And so this is where it gets tricky, and this is why I brought the challenge of inclusion, because Erasmus is it's a central program that is crafted at EU level, but then it's implemented in national levels by national agencies that provide funding to individual institutions, let's say, so to universities, associations, so on and so forth. So this means that the management of the specific opportunities, being traineeship, a study period, or even volunteering and so on, these are managed by organizations. So this means you can have in the same city next to each other 2 organizations that have completely different ways of working in Erasmus. Some of them might have a very good inclusion strategy and be dedicated to reach people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and the other one can just be reaching for the ones who want to be politicians. And so, you know, the pistachio effect. So some of them go for the harder to crack and the others don't. So it's really up to each institution. But if for people who are interested in this, there's really great tools from the youth sector. So there's a website called Salto, and there are lots and lots of inspiring practices, tools, methods that youth workers use to reach different actors. So this can be a good place to start getting inspiration and resources.
Thank you. Then I would like to ask our last question for today, which will perhaps link to our next speaker, because Faith, if I pronounce it correctly, is asking, are those students who hold the Irish passport and living in the UK allowed to apply for the Erasmus program?
So this is tricky because, you know, with the negotiations, they will never give a correct answer. But as long as you have European nationality, you are able to apply legally. But then the specific rules will depend on the institution. So UK universities cannot send someone on Erasmus, for example. But if you live in the UK and you apply for a training course with an institution from Ireland, then you get to go. But I hope this was clear.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for the questions and the engagement that we're seeing in the chat. I will actually continue with our next speaker, who is Stephen Farry, and perhaps he will be able to answer more questions about Northern Ireland. However, we will not be able to do again an online questionnaire as he will speak via video message.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Stephen Farry, the MP for North Down from Northern Ireland. I'm Deputy Leader of the Alliance Party, and formerly I was the Minister for Employment and Learning in Northern Ireland between 2011 and 2016. Sorry I can't be with you today in person for this very important engagement around Erasmus and student mobility, and I hope the event goes very well. But just a few thoughts from myself, particularly around the situation in Northern Ireland. But before we get to that, I mean, just some general comments around what has happened itself. I think the decision of the UK government to discontinue Erasmus, I think it was very regrettable. Indeed, it was extremely petty. There was an open door there for ongoing participation in Erasmus. This is something of mutual benefit both to the UK and to the European Union. But due to very blinkered thinking around Brexit and a determination to be seen to be doing things differently, just to make a point, even when doing so defies all logic, the UK government have decided to go alone and to have put in place their own scheme in terms of the Turing approach. And that, I think, will be very challenging going forward. I think we have to recognise that Erasmus was a huge opportunity for students throughout the European Union and indeed beyond. And it's important to bear in mind that other countries outside the European Union have participated. So this is not something that is specific to the EU, which just reinforces the point around the very negative approach that the government took in terms of its decision making. But this has been key to mobility for students and young people, opening up new horizons, giving people new opportunities and a much wider learning experience, something that will go with them for the rest of their lives and help shape their views and perspectives, both on their own home country and the receiving country, but also the wider world as well. So this is now going to be a huge missed opportunity. In the UK was itself a net recipient in terms of Erasmus students, which came and enlightened our own situation here in terms of their own participation in terms of the universities and colleges that they were associated with. Looking to the future, there's still much uncertainty as to how the Turing scheme will operate. It is notable that it's only about outward movement. There doesn't seem to be a clear strand in terms of inward movement. So it's going to be a one-directional as opposed to a two-directional experience. So already it's only a partial response, and it looks like it's going to be clunky. Now we're hearing a lot of promises about widening access to it, which I think people will approach with a heavy degree of skepticism. Like the rest of the UK, Northern Ireland very much benefited from the Erasmus scheme. Our universities and colleges were also net recipients of students, but there was very considerable outward mobility as well. Looking to the future, Northern Ireland students are set to have, however, a dual opportunity, in the sense that the Irish government have very kindly made a commitment that students in Northern Ireland will be able to have ongoing access to Erasmus schemes via the Irish government. There's still ongoing discussions between the Irish government and Northern Ireland institutions as to exactly how this is going to work, whether it's done directly through the Northern Ireland institutions or whether students will have to temporarily affiliate with a Southern Irish institution in order to take advantage of this. But nonetheless, it provides an opportunity for that ongoing engagement, which would be lost. Under the Brexit withdrawal agreement, it is recognised that some people in Northern Ireland will be EU citizens by stint of the fact that they have Irish passports. And so those people have ongoing EU citizens' rights. But it's very, very important to note that in terms of what's potentially an offer in terms of Erasmus via the Irish government, will cover all students in Northern Ireland, regardless of their identity and passport. So it's not simply going to be something that's open to people with an Irish passport. It'll be open to people with British and indeed those with other passports as well. So that doesn't create that artificial distinction between the different parts of the community in Northern Ireland. So in that sense, that is particularly welcome. And I also note that both Scotland and Wales, and obviously it's a very Welsh focus on today's discussions, are also looking at their own alternatives using their devolved powers to go further than the Turing scheme. So for Northern Ireland, we have overlapping schemes, both Turing and Erasmus, and that should widen people's opportunities. But overall, this decision by the UK government is a huge backward step, and obviously institutions and students who wish to take opportunities will do their best to navigate the more limited opportunities that do exist. But nonetheless, the importance of student mobility, those wider experiences that young people have, remain ever important. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. And following his video, we will continue with a talk from Michael Russell, who will speak about student mobility in Scotland.
Hi, and thanks for the invitation to take part in this. I want to be very clear what my perspective is. I was an education minister. I was Scotland's Cabinet Secretary for Education for 5 years. I had another 5 years dealing with Brexit, which was not the happiest experience of my life, on behalf of the Scottish Government. I am president of the SNP, but I have retired from Parliament and from government. So I'm not here speaking on behalf of the Scottish Government, but I think I can bring a perspective both of what happened and the difficulties that were created by it, and what can perhaps happen now, though I think that will be different in each part of these islands. And we've heard Stephen's introduction to the issue in Northern Ireland and the fact that it may be easier in Northern Ireland for students still to access Erasmus than it will be, for example, in students in Scotland. But let me just start by taking as read the utility of the Erasmus scheme. Indeed, Winnie Ewing, Madame Ecos, one of the foremost European Parliament members for a long time, representing first of all the Highlands of Ireland, Scotland, and then on the wider Scottish list. Winnie Ewing was one of the people who worked very hard to see Erasmus established. And as Erasmus has grown and become Erasmus Plus, the effect of it has been wider than simply, though it's an important effect, the effect on studying in other countries. We've had support for youth work, for example. And Erasmus has become a very important and became a very important part of the educational infrastructure in Scotland. And Scotland's uptake of opportunities under Erasmus was greater proportionally than other parts of these islands. And I think that reflects the enthusiasm that we had. And at the very start of the Brexit negotiations, when the committee was set up, the Joint Negotiating Committee, the JMC, which was part of the structures that existed in devolution, or a new part of the structures, was set up at the end of 2016. From a very early stage, it was clear that Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland all wished Erasmus to continue. And that was injected into the discussion of Brexit through the joint negotiation, the Joint Ministerial Committee at a very early time. I suspect the earliest discussion of it would have been sometime in early 2017. And at that time, the indications that Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish ministers received, and then, of course, Northern Irish ministers were not present at those meetings for a period when devolution was not operating in Northern Ireland, but there were Northern Irish civil servants there. The assurance that was given was that Erasmus was a priority for the UK government to and would be negotiated. And I don't think there was any doubt that that was what we believed would take place. The doubt started to enter into things when the UK government started on what they called a value for money exercise to look at a number of schemes which the UK was part of and which it might be able to continue to be part of after Brexit, whatever type of Brexit there was. Horizon is another one, which of course is now also very much in jeopardy. And that value for money exercise was undertaken without the involvement of the devolved administrations. We were not kept well informed about it, and indeed I have never seen the outcome of that value for money exercise. But as time went on, and this was a very lengthy process, of course, it became more and more clear that the ministers for Scotland and Wales, and when Northern Ireland was present, Northern Ireland, were not getting straight answers to questions about what was happening with this process and what would happen with this process. Now, it wasn't unusual not to get straight answers. Indeed, I don't think I heard or saw a straight answer from UK negotiators or UK ministers during most of the 5 years of the Brexit process. But there was still a belief that Erasmus was so obviously an important part of the educational infrastructure that it should continue. It is perhaps important to note in passing that there were some universities, particularly in England, that were not so keen on Erasmus, and those were universities perhaps which would have liked a different type of scheme, such as the Turing scheme, which is now in existence. But Erasmus was much wider, much deeper, much broader, and much more suited, in our view, to the needs of Scottish students and young people. I think the real concern that Scottish and Welsh ministers would have had, and I know Jeremy Miles will speak about this, or may have spoken about it, I'm sorry, I've only just joined this discussion, but I think the concern began to grow during 2019 and certainly towards the end of that year. And it became obvious that not just we weren't being told things, but that it looked as if there was a less than wholehearted commitment to Erasmus from the UK government. And at that stage, there entered into the discussion issues such as, if the UK government did not support Erasmus, would the UK government make the monies that it spent on it available pro rata to the devolved administrations so that they could continue to be parts of it? And that was never denied, but it was never granted either. And as usual, there was a real resistance to thinking that there could be any different settlement for Scotland and Wales, for example, than there would be for the rest of the UK, although that was perfectly possible to negotiate. And it could have been negotiated with the EU, and we know that, and it certainly could have been negotiated with the devolved administrations. In any case, people know the outcome of this. At the very last moment, it became clear that Erasmus was not going to be included in the package. There was very substantial protest made by the devolved administrations, and again, the point was made very strongly by myself and by others that what should happen, if that was the decision, the wrong decision by the UK government, then the devolved administration should be given the resources that were spent on it and be able themselves to spend it. And that was always batted away. It was never properly addressed. The Turing scheme was introduced essentially like a rabbit out of a hat. It, as I say, does not substitute for the Erasmus scheme, but that was the fait accompli with which the devolved administrations were faced. Now, a reaction to that has all the devolved administrations have been to say this is unsatisfactory and that we need to have the Erasmus scheme and we want to be part of the Erasmus scheme. But the ability to do so has been very limited. I think it's been made very clear by the EU that devolved administration participation per se would not be possible. That is directly substituting for the UK. However, it would be possible for the devolved administrations to devise their own schemes which imitated in whatever way was possible the Erasmus scheme and to make negotiate those perhaps individually with other administrations who might be interested in EU member states. Perhaps the happiest outcome that's likely to come from this in the short term and short medium term will be in Ireland, as Stephen has indicated, where there is a possibility for those, of course, who have continuing who have Irish passports and continuing European citizenship to participate. And the very generous offer of the Irish government to make sure that all students in Northern Ireland benefit from that is very much to be welcomed. I know Wales has developed and is in the process of bringing forward a scheme which I think is significantly better than Turing and will be of great utility. The difficulties in Scotland have been greater. The take-up of the schemes was greater. The pressure upon our budgets is very severe. Brexit has caused very severe financial pressures in a variety of ways. Obviously, in the performance of the economy is one of them, but also in the shortfalls that the devolved administrations have received compared to the resources that they would have received from the EU, for example, for the social fund and funds like that. It is inevitable. It is always the case that when negotiations take place with the UK on replacement funds or funds for things that have become devolved, then there is always a shortfall. The UK Treasury always endeavours to claw back money. And that is the case in terms of substitution for European funds and will continue to be the case. So it is difficult to resource adequately what needs to take place. But the Scottish Government, as I understand it, and again, I'm not speaking for them, I've not given up on that pursuit, that the Scottish Government is continuing to consult with a range of organisations and individuals to try and construct something that can take forward. But I must make the final point is simply to say that as far as I am concerned, as far as many are concerned, the surest way to recover Erasmus is to rejoin the EU. That may be something that has been abandoned by parties elsewhere. It is not something that's been abandoned in Scotland. And as a result of which, there is active ongoing debate about that and the way in which that can happen by Scotland becoming independent and applying to join the EU. And that is the route I hope that we will take. Now, there needs to be some interim activity, and that is what is being worked on. I see that there are two questions, just in passing, I'll touch on. Do I know if Scotland will be launching their own student mobility programs? Well, as I'm indicating, I think Scotland would like to do that. I'm not speaking for the government. It has not yet done so, and there are financial and other pressures, but those consultations continue. And secondly, do I know the economic impact of the UK's withdrawal from Erasmus and the Scottish economy? That's a very interesting point. I don't have those figures, but I do think that it's something that needs to be worked through. It will be considerable, and it'll be considerable on the infrastructure of Scottish education. And of course, it won't simply be direct costs, but there is the cost of lost opportunity, and the cost of opportunity is likely to be very considerable. So I think the background to it, I hope, is helpful. I think the present discussion, I think, will bear fruit, though I can't put a timescale on it. But I also think that the best opportunity for Scotland, and indeed, for the rest of the UK, but I can't take responsibility for that, but the best opportunity for Scotland is to ensure that Scotland rejoins the EU and rejoins the Erasmus scheme as a full member. And that's what we would intend to do. I'm, of course, happy to address other issues people want to address. I have to be away comparatively soon, but if there are things that I've said that need clarified or points that you would want me to make, then I'm happy to address those if they're helpful.
Thank you so much for your amazing talk about the Scottish perspective. Whilst you were talking, we had a lot of questions and comments in the comment section. And one of the questions asked is from Rhiannon, who is asking, has anyone done a value for money analysis, if not the UK government?
Well, we know that the UK government has done a value for money analysis, but we've not had access to it. So I don't think I've ever seen the criteria that were applied to this. I mean, that sounds very strange, but actually that was just typical of how the Joint Ministerial Committee worked and how the arrangements between the countries worked. Getting information was difficult. I think, therefore, I would be resistant on doing that. I would like to know what the impact is. That's the value for money story. The impact of not having Erasmus on the Scottish economy and Scottish education. But I don't question the value for money of the Erasmus scheme, because the evidence of that is all around. The evidence of that is in the students and young people who have taken part in it. It is in the testimonies that one hears from them, and it is from the academic institutions themselves, which are very enthusiastic about this. I have an involvement with Glasgow University on a part-time basis, and I know many of my colleagues there bitterly miss not just students going out, but of course the effect of students coming in and the churn that takes place. Now, there are some small technical things that universities can do that could help. Joint appointments is one of them. For example, a joint appointment between an Irish university and a Scottish university can lead to a joint course, which may well qualify, under Erasmus regulations for Ireland. But those would be at the margins of what one would really want to see, which is a full re-entry to the scheme.
Thank you. And can Scotland access Erasmus Plus if it first joins the European Free Trade Area as a stepping stone to the EU?
I think the answer to that is yes, but I think it would be an unnecessarily complicated route, as far as I'm concerned. Scotland voted in 2016 substantially to remain in the EU. There is no evidence that situation has changed. The progressive parties in the Scottish Parliament, which are in government in Scotland, the Greens and the SNP, are fully in favour of rejoining the EU, and by so doing would rejoin the programmes of the EU, including Erasmus. There are some people in Scotland who talk about EFTA membership and EEA membership. I can understand it, but it seems to me that is not nearly as good as the real thing.
Thank you. And then I have a question from Gary, who would like to ask if it can't engage with Erasmus. Could the Scottish government cooperate with other governments in Europe at regional and national level to facilitate two-way exchange?
Yes, I know, Gary, and Gary, you're absolutely correct. That is possible to do, and there are active exchange programs taking place. Because what Erasmus does is it creates a much bigger context and a much wider range of opportunities, and it institutionalizes that. So it works on a much larger scale. But yes, and of course, I know people who are trying actively to do that and to make sure that's taking place. Erasmus also, it benefits from the enthusiasm of academics and others who want to see it take place. And Scotland has also lost and continues to lose, valuable people working in universities and higher education and further education from other European countries who find, for example, the research opportunities to be much reduced. Brexit is a miserable thing that has no advantages. So you can work around the edges of it. But one of the best things to do, I think, is to say we don't want it. We want to actually be where the action is, which is within the EU.
And just a curiosity, to what extent do you think that student mobility would have an impact on the Scottish referendum that is upcoming?
Well, it's an interesting point. I haven't thought about it. I think there is some evidence that EU citizens, for example, who may have voted no in 2014 because they were told erroneously that Scotland couldn't be in the EU and that they couldn't stay. I think many European citizens will now vote yes because they realise that it is the route back into a reasonable and reasoned relationship. I think as far as student mobility is concerned, students will be able to vote. There is Scottish qualification for voting is residence, and therefore if you are legally resident, you will be able to vote. I hope that they will be enthusiastic about the prospects of independence for a variety of reasons.
Thank you. And as a last thought of sharing, to what extent do you think that Scotland has been included in the Brexit negotiations, and especially as Scotland and Wales came out together with a joint statement against the UK government withdrawing from student mobility programs such as the Erasmus program?
Well, Scotland and Wales, I mean, Jeremy, I think, is due to come on, I understand, after me. And Jeremy and I were both members of the Joint Ministerial Committee. And his predecessor on that was Mark Drakeford, who is now the Welsh First Minister. And we weren't consulted. This was pretty nightmarish for the 5 years that the Joint Ministerial Committee existed. The Brexit ushered in a government which is hostile to devolution. I mean, there's a connection between the two, but there's a government at Westminster that's hostile to devolution. It's hostile to the devolved governments having the ability to do things. And Erasmus is simply an example of that. And it's an example of how there was actually utter confusion in the Brexit process from the first period right up until the Chequers meeting. Thereafter, there was the hardest of Brexits being put into place. And it was almost as if the UK government feared contamination by taking part and accepting taking part in any programme that the EU had and which you could still take part in. And that extraordinary view has unfortunately damaged and upset the life chances of so many young people. We have to do the best to mitigate against that we possibly can. But the reality is that decision laid with the essentially the Tory Brexiteers who accepted an utterly false premise for which we are now all paying.
Thank you so much for your time and for the amazing explanation on Scotland and for clarifying everything that has happened, and also for laying this connection with Wales, which brings me to our following speaker, Jeremy Miles, Minister for Education and for Welsh language, who will continue speaking about the Wales programme, the Tate Scheme.
Hi, Noswitha, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. Well, good evening, and thank you for the chance to join the discussion and speak to everybody. It's I think it's a very important time to be discussing student mobility, both in terms of the programmes, both in terms of the opportunities available. I think that the international exchange in recent years, in the UK at least, has been affected by the dual shocks of leaving the European Union, which I know you were discussing with Mike Russell just now, and the subsequent loss, obviously, of Erasmus Plus, and also, of course, the pandemic. So I wanted to say a little bit at the start about the impact of that, and then to say a bit, if I may, about what we are doing in Wales to ensure that those opportunities, particularly for young people, aren't lost. So in terms of leaving the European Union, let's deal with that first. I won't say too much about it because the audience for this discussion obviously will know about it in very great detail and will have the same strong feelings that I have about it. I'm very sure about that. Just as you were discussing now with Microsoft, before I became Minister for Education and Welsh Language, I was Minister for European Transition, and Microsoft and I were on very many occasions in a situation where we had interlocutors across the table in the UK government who had a very fundamentally different view from us in a range of ways about our relationship with the European Union. And one of those, obviously, was in relation to Erasmus Plus. During the negotiations, whether it was speaking with groups like this one today or at those interministerial groups that I just mentioned, I always felt that Erasmus Plus received a level of focus and of attention, probably far greater than its financial cost or implications, really, and that's for a very good reason, because for those of us who understood the programme well, I think it served in many ways as an exemplar, if you like, of all the benefits of European cooperation. It was a sort of the perfect example of it in many ways, creating real and very much life-changing opportunities very often for young people. And so, its loss was very keenly felt in Wales and in other parts of the UK, as we've just heard as well. So our position as a government was crystal clear and consistent from the get-go. We absolutely wanted to continue to participate in Erasmus Plus, and we absolutely believed that the UK government should have negotiated for our future participation, and I think the reasons they didn't do that were entirely political. I've no doubt that the uncertainty of the years leading up to our departure from the European Union, and particularly the ludicrous, ill-advised threats of the no deal, really damaged our partnerships in Europe. And we're now working hard to restore those and to grow those partnerships. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But the other impact of leaving the European Union was obviously the loss of free movement. And that obviously has damaged the opportunities for international mobility for learners, particularly actually for apprentices and those in vocational education and training. And it's harder to fix that. But we continue to highlight the damage that the UK government's policy is doing in relation to that. And the second shock was obviously the pandemic. In 2020, borders closing down, shut down thousands of planned mobility exchanges and a range of collaborations, and it's obviously taken time to re-establish those links. I don't really want to dwell too much today on the damage that the pandemic has done to those opportunities. I think the meeting really, and we're here to talk about the future really, but I think you could say that there were some positive impacts. It's hard to think of that really objectively, isn't it? But there were some positive impacts, I think, in some ways on mobility as a consequence of what happened during the pandemic, at least. The first, maybe obviously, is the move online and the growth in our online literacy and in platforms across the world, just like this meeting now, obviously, that we are holding virtually, has brought the world closer, put simply. And that's a good thing. That's a thing to be celebrated. For all that we do, all that we will try to do, there unfortunately will always be some young people who feel they're not able to travel as part of their studies. They will have a range of reasons for that. Some of it will be personal, some of it may be health related, caring responsibilities, other responsibilities. There'll be circumstances in individual lives. And so, the growth, I think, in that interconnectedness, the digital interconnectedness, means we're looking at new ways to bring the benefits of international exchange to young people who might otherwise just miss out on that. But the second benefit, I think, which I just want to highlight, is to physical travel itself. I think this is a little more counterintuitive. obviously the closing of borders has clearly had a negative impact on mobility in the short term. But I do think that the reopening of international exchanges has sort of unleashed really a new wave of galvanised young people, certainly from across Wales, and as a result of that, I think the demand for opportunities for mobility in person hasn't been higher. So I think the question we have to ask is how we respond to that demand. And I just want to say a little bit about what we are doing in Wales, and I think in a way we may have gone further than other parts of the UK in this, but very happy to have that broad discussion. So March last year, just before the last Senedd elections, the Welsh Government announced that we were investing £65 million in an international learning exchange programme for Wales. We've now called it TAITH, incidentally, which some viewers and listeners will recognise as the Welsh word for journey. So TAITH is ambitious, and I think it's a pretty decisive response on our part to the shocks that I highlighted earlier. TAITH will have 3 pathways. I was discussing this with the Executive Director of TAITH this morning. We're calling them pathways. They are effectively our name for the different funding streams. And it'll support the mobility both of learners and staff across the entire education sector in Wales, and that includes youth work and adult education settings as well. So my basic message is, if you're learning or if you work in an education provider in Wales at any level, I want TAITH to be there to support you. And it has a genuine focus on improving access to international exchange opportunities for learners from underrepresented groups. And actually will offer the most generous support packages for those learners in the country. And that goes even further actually than Erasmus Plus did. And crucially, TAITH also embeds the idea of reciprocity as a fundamental principle. So it has funding for both inward and outward mobility, which is incorporated flexibly, obviously, in every project. And that means that we can take Wales to the world, really, but also obviously bring the world to Wales. And I believe very strongly, as I know that we will all do, that our campuses and classrooms are fundamentally enriched by having on them and within them students and staff from other countries, other cultures, spending time with us, sharing their time, their experience with us. And the benefits that they bring, I think, spread through our education providers, obviously, but also have a broader ripple effect, if you like, into our communities, which I think is a very positive thing. So applications for Pathway 1, which is the main pathway, and that supports individuals to spend time abroad, effectively. That just closed in May. And TAITH will be announcing the successful projects at the end of this month. The demand for it was very strong, and I think and hope, certainly, obviously, that that will only grow, even from a strong base, as TAITH continues to be established. And just to say, TAITH has gone from an idea on a piece of paper in March of last year to being about to offer the first mobility support from the start of the next academic year. So just to say that I think that's an extraordinary achievement in its own terms, and I just want to acknowledge my thanks to the TAITH team for doing that. The second pathway, I said there were 3 pathways. The second pathway supports strategic projects with an intellectual output, and that opens in August. And then there's a third pathway which will effectively be used to extend the benefits of TAITH to those underrepresented groups even further. So we'll be informed in some ways by the earlier pathways, and that will be launched next year. And that's a focus on accessing the programmes effectively. So for those of you who are in Wales, I hope you will support TAITH and encourage others to participate. And I hope it's clear from what I've said today and from the TAITH programme that when it comes to international education exchange in Wales. We are absolutely on the journey ar y daith, as we say. Felly, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. I've got a lot of questions coming in, and I would like to start with the first one. Let me. Oh, sorry. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I'll start again. Thank you, Jeremy. I have a lot of questions coming in, and the first one is from Rhiannon, who has asked it before, but she wants to know what the Welsh government can do to encourage Scotland to cooperate with Tate.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that. Could you say that again?
Rhiannon is asking. It's also shown up in our screen.
Okay.
How or what can the Welsh government do to encourage Scotland to cooperate with Tate?
Well, we're very happy to work in any way with Scotland in relation to it. I know that listening to Michael speak earlier, that Scotland, the Scottish Government has the same commitment that we do in Wales to international mobility. You know, the truth is that that's been a feature of all parts of the UK in reality. The fact that the UK government decided not to participate in Erasmus is, I think, no reflection on appetite in England for exchange. Obviously, it was very high, and I really think it was an act of self-harm, really, on the part of the UK government to withdraw or not allow us to continue with Erasmus Plus. But very keen to work with any other government in any other country to support the ambitions that we have in common, certainly.
And would you be able to provide a short overview on the numbers involved in the scheme? So how many go out and come into Wales, and what is the budget for the foreseen numbers to increase?
Yeah, so the budget is a £65 million budget, extending over 5 years, maybe longer than that. It has an element which is around outward mobility, and that covers both students and learners at all levels, and staff rather. And then an inward mobility dimension as well, both for students and staff, which is up to 30% of total awards. And then each of the projects will also receive support for organisational costs, preparatory visits, and as I was alluding to in my comments earlier, to the additional costs for participation for those participants who have barriers in their way to participate. We are aiming to see 15,000 outbound participants, 10,000 inbound participants, 50 new partnerships, and 40 countries in total involved. So that's the aim that we have. I'm very sure we'll meet that. The level of enthusiasm for Taith has been significant, and I was discussing this morning with, as I said, the executive director, the work that they have been doing in building those bridges already with different international organisations, including all parts of international education systems. So they were describing to me discussions they were having with Dutch schools, for example, and just I think it very much embodies that sort of outward-looking approach that we want to continue to have in Wales, and that it provides a set of connections with different parts of the world, which are just fantastic. So those are the numbers. That's the money. But I think underpinning all of that is a sort of focus on the learner, education staff, and those that reciprocity, the mutuality of those international connections is really important.
It's great to hear that there is such an excitement for the Tate programme. Then I have another question, which relates to our first conversation today from Joanna. Does Tate include anything like e-twinning scheme that the Erasmus Plus programme offers?
Well, I don't. So there's an element of online support for the twinning arrangements which we have, but I'm very keen to make sure that, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that I think there is potential from what we've learned over the last 2 years in particular, to make sure that those who don't feel that they can take advantage of in-person mobility are not excluded. So that is a dimension to it. But I'm keen to make sure as well that anybody who is able to take advantage of in-person mobility at all levels, including for school levels. I know your question was about e-twinning for schools, but I think there's an opportunity for schools to be participating in the in-person exchanges as well here, which is great. And we've had, the Pathway 1 has had applications from all parts of the education system, including those which have, maybe in the past not been hugely prominent, really, so in Erasmus. So we're very pleased about that.
That's great to hear. And before we go to our last speaker, who will represent students both in Europe and in the UK, my question is, how does TAFE represent students better than the other opportunities that students may have?
Well, so we've been very clear, for example, that so the comparison which is often put to me is around touring in the UK, obviously. And my view, our view as a government, is that I want Welsh organisations to take full advantage of TAFE, but also take full advantage of the touring scheme. So I don't see it as a sort of, it's not set up in competition, and it's not set up to, plug gaps in Erasmus. It's its own programme. It is a very ambitious programme. Obviously, I've given you a sense of the scale of it already. It's not limited, as it were, to Europe. It goes across the world. But if people are able to take advantage of more than one scheme, then they should do that. What I would say, since you're inviting me to say it, I think the touring is just a more limited scheme, really. It doesn't support inward mobility, rather surprisingly. And I think, just as I was saying earlier, international mobility opportunities are built on partnerships, and that requires mutuality, reciprocity, and in that way, touring is a bit of a one-way street. But if institutions are able to take advantage of it, then they should. It's a good thing to do that.
Thank you so much for sharing your mind, your thoughts, and your expertise with us today, and for representing all that considers about the TAFE program and learning those who didn't know yet about the pathways and about their opportunities for the upcoming academic year. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
And I would like to continue with our last speaker of today, Iona Murdoch, the president of the Erasmus Student Network in the United Kingdom, and she will be here with us today to represent young voices in the UK and in Europe.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? My microphone's working, right? I actually can't see you, so we're just going to go with it. As I was introduced, I'm Iona Murdoch, the president of Erasmus Student Network UK, and I will talk you through our perspective on the Erasmus shift in the UK and all the other opportunities available. Could I possibly get my slides shared? Hopefully. Amazing. Okay, so the question that I want to start with, are students still wanting to go abroad right now? I realise I will start this presentation by saying that ESN UK represents students in higher education and not so much the students that are in primary and secondary schools, as I do realise that there are quite a few teachers in the chat function watching, including one of my old secondary school teachers, which is a bit crazy. So yes, I will. So the truth is, the number of students that have been using Erasmus Plus to and from the UK have actually been dropping in numbers since Brexit, before we even withdrew from Erasmus Plus. And I quite like to just let that settle for a second, because it's not something that we're often aware and think of. But there is a reason for it. And if we could jump to the next slide, I'm going to bring you a few factors that are already hindering mobility, and it is not just a lack of opportunities provided by Erasmus. One of the big things that we see when we're supporting our students coming into the UK on exchange or returning after being on exchange as well as ESN, we get quite a lot of questions over visa applications and requirements. So one of the big impacts that we saw after Brexit was students trying to go on exchange and not knowing how to, not through opportunities, but through the visa processes. And that's one of the big blocks, especially also students coming to the UK. And from what I'm aware, it's one of the big issues that schools are facing as well. It's the visa applications being more expensive, more complicated, and not entirely clear. And having that lack of easy access to the EU is one of the difficulties. Low confidence after distance learning and COVID years as well. That's a big thing. We don't really think about it as much, but students have been going into higher education and they've been sitting at home in their rooms studying, often without as much contact with their friends, without their teachers in person. And a lot of students have struggled with that, especially then transitioning into a university or college environment. A lot of students have, when we've asked them why they've not wanted to go on exchange, if they knew that there were opportunities available, they would still say, I don't really want to do that right now because I don't feel comfortable. And that's because their comfort zone is usually up here and they're really excited to go on exchange. There was a recent survey done by UCAS that stated that students who are engaged in international topics going on exchanges in schools, they come to university and they really want to go on exchange. Indeed, they sometimes even pick what university they go to for that Erasmus or mobility experience. But they're now coming, and instead of being up here, their confidence is here. And that's because they're not used to this new environment. A couple of people that I've spoken to quite a lot have been going into their second or third year with the opportunity to go on exchange, and they're not ready to do it because they've not had what they perceive as the university experience in their home institution. I'm not saying that this will stay forever, but it does give us time as a sector in the UK to work out where we want to go in the next couple of years, so that when our students are ready, when we help them facilitate that transition back to them being excited and confident to go on exchange, we know how to help them. Lack of awareness of opportunities is always going to be a thing, especially the confusion that we're facing right now. It's improved slightly in the past couple of months, but there has been a gap of, okay, we're out of Erasmus. What do we do now? How do our students go on exchange? How do they get those opportunities? How do they talk to international students where they used to? And there has been a lot of confusion over even just how to register for the touring scheme, which is the replacement. Students weren't sure how to do this. They didn't know if it was them or the institution. And students didn't know whether they could even go in the first place. So one of the big things that ESN UK have been doing is making them aware of these opportunities and ensuring that people know how to go abroad if they want to. Obviously, we don't support visa processes, but we're at least there to answer questions and support them and help them with the culture shock, give them a new environment when they do manage to go abroad. Financial and personal barriers to long mobilities, that is something that people have faced, and it's something that the touring scheme argued they do very well because they provide a very short-term mobility opportunity of a week or more. And this is for people who might have financial barriers. They might have the fear of not being able to get a job when they go abroad for 6 months or a year, and they feel like Erasmus for a semester is quite a long time. Or personal barriers, socioeconomic backgrounds. They might be a child who's caring for an elderly or sick relative at home and they can't go abroad. So having these barriers often stops people going on exchange. And finally, a lack of resources. HR at universities to support students wanting to go on exchange is quite low. A lot of students might want to go on exchange. There might be opportunities. They might know that there's opportunities, but the universities don't have the resources to support them. And this is sometimes often the cases in schools as well. They don't know how to go abroad, and half the time the opportunities are there, but they're not aware of them because the HR at the universities aren't there to tell them about it. This is a report that was done a couple of years ago by Universities UK. That's an organisation that represents all of the universities' interests in the UK, and they work quite well. The international branch, had a campaign called Go International that was running a few years ago, and they did a report in 2018 with a summer survey with a lot of different institutions. By institutions, I mean universities and colleges, higher education institutions. And they found that the biggest barrier wasn't actually the lack of opportunities, but the lack of resources in the institution to show it, to educate students on what their opportunities are. So this is actually one of the big things that we need to work on. We do have opportunities in the UK, but we don't know where to find them, where to go to find them. Even if we brought back Erasmus, we still would have that problem of needing to make sure that schools, universities, colleges all have the HR and the resources to be able to support the students when they're there. Lack of student engagement as well, that has dipped, as I mentioned, even more than usual because of COVID and the visa processing block, which just scares students. So it's not just a question of what opportunities are there or not, it's how to engage students in them and making sure that we have the foundations there as well to support them when they do go. And I just want to note that in the survey, we've been talking a lot about the lack of Erasmus, but 94% of the respondents actually also mentioned that they offer their own programs in the forms of summer schools, subject field trips, and other exchange programs. Often universities even having grants, scholarships, and funding for those students to go abroad to further afield. So although Erasmus applied for anywhere in Europe within the EU, all of these universities have other connections with other institutions further than that in other continents, and they had funding and they were sending their students there as well. And they had the same barriers as we can see, the lack of resources, the lack of student engagement. So this is something that we really need to work and focus on as a sector. Okay, a very quick summary of the main opportunities that there are. I do realise that we've already discussed some of these, so I won't go into too much detail. But the Turing Scheme, we all know this is the big fancy UK replacement for Erasmus+. It's a global outward mobility. That's one of the selling points of it. As I mentioned, Erasmus is very EU country. Turing Scheme goes further. It means that universities are not just having to find the money to fund students to go abroad, or not funding students to go abroad to countries like America and Canada and Australia, or Asian countries, African countries. It means that the Turing Scheme can help fund these students too. So it's a wider, more global outward mobility programme. It does have a lot of money that's gone into it, although there are questions over comparisons of how much that money is compared to what we paid for Erasmus. I won't go into that because I am not a statistician and I don't do data too well. But it's a good scheme in terms of the global mobility, and for widening access, the whole point of the Turing Scheme was it's supposed to be wider for lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And after the first year of it being used, it was reported that almost 50% of people who were engaging in it, students in high schools, students in primary and secondary schools, were from disadvantaged backgrounds. So they are actually holding up to their word of doing this. The TAFE, which I won't go into too much because this has already been discussed, but this is an amazing opportunity. It's a bit like the Turing Scheme and Erasmus mixed together, I like to think. It's got the best of both. It's got the global output that the Turing Scheme has, but the opportunities of the Erasmus Plus program that we had as well. It's bilateral, so it goes both ways. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing that we now have in Wales, and anyone who studies in Wales can access this. I noticed that this was one of the questions actually in the comments halfway through. But I just want to clarify that all of these programs that we're discussing today are not based on the nationality of the person, it's the institution that they study in. So whether you're a Welsh student, a Scottish student, someone from America, if you're studying in Wales, then you can participate in this program. And and that's the same for Erasmus as well. If you do want to partake in an Erasmus program, but you're a UK student, you can always study in a country that has Erasmus and still be able to go on exchange, even if you're a UK student. Okay, and the third program, Erasmus Plus, I have mentioned this, but there has been an exciting update to the latest cycle, 2021 to 27. And that is that 20% of the funding provided is for global mobilities, including the UK. This isn't something that UK studying students can participate in, but it does mean that students who are coming to the UK can get funded by Erasmus. So all of the money that each institution gets, they can dedicate 20% of that for students to be able to go further than the EU. And that does include the UK, luckily. So we will still be seeing students coming into the UK, even if we don't have Erasmus. And that does create some kind of bilateral method of mobility, with the touring scheme going one way and Erasmus going the other. Something that has also changed with Erasmus, which I'm very excited about, is a green travel top-up. So I would really like to see that as one of the things that we have in our current mobility programs. If students want to travel sustainably by train or by ferry or bus or whatever to get to their exchange, having a top-up to add and help that, because it's always more expensive to travel sustainably, having that would be a really nice thing to have. Okay, some alternatives to the traditional mobility program that we know of in higher education institutions. Nothing is stopping people from engaging in alternative things like internships or volunteering. There is a belief that it has to be done through Erasmus. It's not necessarily true. There are still ways that we can do it. And yes, there's the visa issue, but there are still ways to go abroad and experience that incredible opportunity that you can have of going to a different country, becoming a global citizen, and improving your intercultural awareness and making you more employable in the long run. Erasmus Intern is an amazing website. I would encourage all of you to have a look at it, maybe not during, but after I finish talking. And it's a platform that is got loads and loads of different opportunities, paid and unpaid, volunteering, internships, traineeships, and it's all over the world. So you can go to many, many different countries in this. And although it says Erasmus Intern, we are still able to participate in it. It would just mean that we'd probably need to get a visa to work in another country, but it's open to everyone. International Citizen Service is another platform that we can look at, and the British Council China Internship Programme. There's quite a few different ways that we can go abroad through different internships or volunteering opportunities. There's also very specific degree opportunities like ELSA, which is the European Law Society Association. There's very similar organizations for dentists, medics, businesses, all of these kind of things. And students can still engage in these methods of mobility. And usually they're paid, which is quite nice. So although you're not getting a grant, it is still possible to self-sustain yourself. And virtual internships. This is something that's come up through the pandemic, and it's a really nice way to be more inclusive. Students might not necessarily be able to go abroad because of XYZ barriers that we mentioned before. This is a new way of seeing education. Although you're not going physically to a new country, you can still experience how to study in a different institution, how to work in a different institution, how to work in a different country environment, because the labour market is very different in every country you can go to. So this is a way of, even if you are, for whatever reason, not able to go abroad physically, you can still engage in an exchange or internship virtually and communicate with international students. And we like to call this kind of approach an internationalization at home, where students can stay in their own country but still engage in international activities and get the benefits on a real level. Okay, studying abroad for a full degree. This is something I touched upon. You can still go and study abroad. There is nothing stopping you. There are many different scholarships available for degrees. There's many different countries who provide very cheap or free degrees. If people do want to have that experience, there's nothing stopping you from doing it. In Scotland, there is something called the Saltire Scholarship, and that's for Scottish students or students studying in Scotland to be able to go for master's programs in America, possibly Canada, I can't remember. If it's wrong, ignore me, but definitely at least America. And it also has a nice cultural aspect to it. You can also target free or low-cost education countries like Norway or Germany. You find a lot of international students going to those countries for bachelor's or master's programs, and that's a really nice way to also have that experience. Okay. And that's the rest of my presentation. I will finish by just saying some ideas that I have. So one of the things that we have started doing in ESN UK is a project called Mobility in Schools. Some of our colleagues in other countries in ESN, I'll call it Erasmus in Schools. You might have an idea of what it is. So based on the idea of internationalization at home, and based on the idea of the report that I mentioned by UCAS, where students are more likely to go on exchange if in school. For example, myself, I went to Slovenia when I was in school, got really excited and motivated. I also went to Germany a few times. I wouldn't have even thought about studying abroad on an Erasmus exchange in Sweden and making that a focus of my degree if I hadn't gone on exchange in school or had an amazing teacher to educate us in different cultures. So having things like mobility in schools, where we have students coming into high schools or primary schools and bringing up these conversations with school kids, getting them to think about other countries. One of our sections in the north of England went into a number of different high schools, and she had this really cool project where they basically had a little passport that they gave all of the kids, and they had a different activity for 4 or 5 different countries. So for example, for France, I believe they had like spaghetti and some kind of marshmallow, and they built the Eiffel Tower and learned a bit about the French culture. They did the same for a couple of different other countries around the globe. And that was a nice way of bringing them in from the beginning. I know the touring scheme does have school projects where students can either go somewhere else within the UK or abroad. That's a really nice way to engage students as well. Thinking about how Erasmus works with the 20% global mobility, something that we could advocate for is making that something that we can do with schools as well, because this 20% global mobility is for students in high school and also the professors or educators. So it's very much a higher education thing. If we could lower that to also include primary and secondary schools, we could also possibly complement it with the touring scheme and have it working bilaterally, or at least complementing each other that way. That would be a nice way. It wouldn't quite replace the e-twinning projects that we've had in the past, but it would have that kind of element. And I would also like to mention, because I realized that it wasn't in the presentation, but another way to go abroad is Erasmus Mundus. This is, again, has the word Erasmus in it, so it's often confusing, but students in the UK can engage in Erasmus Mundus. It's a global program where anyone around the world is allowed to participate. And it's basically a master's degree that you spend a different semester or term at a different university. So you go around 3 or 4 universities throughout your degree and you get that mobility experience. I think that's everything that I had on my list to cover from the chat as well as my presentation. So I'll end it here and take some questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Iona, for your presentation. It really shows that student representation remains of great importance, especially in conversations such as these. A question from the audience is from Joe, who is asking whether there is a compendium of all the universities that currently take part in Erasmus Plus, and possibly an archive copy of those UK universities that used to take part.
The Erasmus Plus, it's something that I don't know the answer to directly, I've got to be honest. If there is a record, I would guess it would be internal. I do know that a lot of universities who did have Erasmus agreements are still using those agreements, they're still honouring them, and they are still having exchanges to those universities. It's just not necessarily funded by Erasmus anymore, and quite a lot of universities are now just subsequenting it with the touring scheme funding. This year specifically, we were still able to use some Erasmus Plus funding as well from the previous cycle, because of the pandemic meant that money wasn't getting used as much. So we were able to use that as well to use to fund more mobilities. But in terms of an actual compendium, I'm not sure if that even exists. And I'm not sure if we'd be able to know it because of GDPR, but Universities UK might know, so get in touch with them would be my advice.
Thank you. I hope that answers her question. And I have a last question from Scott, who is asking about students with autism who have completed their undergraduate degree. Could they still participate in a master's program in a European country? I know you have spoken about the Erasmus Mundus joint masters, but perhaps you could elaborate more on the autism aspect of this story to explain to us how people with autism would still be able to include in all these study mobility programs.
So I would say studying in the UK, the touring scheme, is actually very inclusive for these kind of things. It's been proven to be quite good. I believe that the TAFE is an excellent programme and would cater to anybody's needs, regardless of disability or not. If you would like to study a master's in an EU country, I would always encourage it. I know I touched upon Germany being an example of quite a cheap country to do a master's in as well for an international student. And also Norway, as much as they're not technically in the EU, they still participate in Erasmus. So even if you wanted to study there, you would still be able to participate, even if you're a UK student. So yes, go wild, study abroad, and use Erasmus in your country or a different program and wherever you study. Don't stay in the UK. If you can go abroad and get the experience, do it.
Thank you, Iona. Go wild, go abroad. That's a great statement to close today's webinar. And thank you so much for participating in this event today, as well as all the other speakers for sharing their stories with us. And the audience for their great engagement and listening to these important discussions. And finally, to all organisations who made this event happen: the Young European Movement UK, Wales for Europe, European Movement in Scotland, European Movement UK, Europeers, and the Centre for International Learning and Leadership UK. We would love for all of you to stay in touch and join us in future events. And before I close today's event, I would like to end with a short statement of Mike Galsworthy, who has said previously that there are lots of people in our universities, for example in the UK, that didn't even have the chance to travel or do placements in other countries, but they did get to meet people their own age from all these other countries, because the Erasmus scheme was bringing them to their universities and to their towns. And today, following the withdrawal from the Erasmus programme, these new opportunities that have emerged in the UK, they will take over to ensure that students will still be able to participate, because the experience of a study abroad is so incredibly important, as we have seen today. So thank you all.